Nothing on behalf of the state, Your Honor.
No, sir, Your Honor.
Sheriff, you may advise that you're Good morning, ladies and gentlemen.
Good morning.
We thank you for coming back and being with us today. Proof that she took you up.
Good morning, Dr.
Good morning.
Sort of jumped in with both feet before I had you lay some, what I believe is some essential groundwork. So we're going to back up just a little bit. You indicated that when you evaluate folks, that you are performing assessments on people who are charged with crimes. Is that correct?
That is correct.
And that you said that you were evaluating them to determine their mental health at the time of the offense. Is that right?
Yes.
What does that mean?
That means that I look for evidence of a mental disorder prior to the crime, and I look to see if there are any changes afterwards. So I look for evidence of behavioral disorders, mental disorders before, any indication that there might have been some during, and then behavioral evidence after the crime. And again, I overlay that with what I know about the evidence.
So what types of things are you looking for in your evaluation when you're trying to determine whether someone had a mental, there was a mental illness at the time of the offense?
Well, I try to obtain as much clarification as I can about the person's diagnosis, because without a diagnosis, then there isn't going to be a mental state defense.
And are you looking for the person's ability to form intent to commit a specific crime?
If that's one of the questions that was asked, so for this type of evaluation regarding a mental state at the time of the events, that would be one of the elements, yes.
And in that, is that you're evaluating the person's ability to make and carry out plans?
Yes.
And their cognitive functioning at the time of the offense?
That's one of the factors.
And perhaps awareness of the wrongfulness of his actions at the time of the offense?
That's another item that I look at, yes.
Are there any other items that you look for when you were specifically trying to determine the person's mental state at the time of the offense?
Well, for cases of insanity, I always look at whether they understand the nature and quality of the act. So what they were doing, and did they understand the specific subsets of what they were doing.
And when you were assessing this defendant, the information that he was giving you and the information you were provided to review, were you doing it with this backdrop in mind?
Yes.
Were you aware of the diagnosis that the defendant had received at Central Prison of post-traumatic stress disorder at the time of your evaluation?
At the time of my very first encounter with Mr. Campbell, I was aware that there was some element of his of a diagnosis that had been made regarding this crime. Yes.
What is post-traumatic stress disorder?
Post-traumatic stress disorder is essentially the body's reaction to severe trauma. So it can be a whole host of different types of traumatic events. At work, sometimes we have staff get assaulted by patients. That can be an example of something that will cause post-traumatic stress disorder, because the person then has to go back into that same environment where they were already assaulted. The whole diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder came about after veterans were returning from Vietnam, and doctors realized that they had a whole host of behavior problems, and that is how the concept of behavioral problems resulting from trauma came about. Over time, so originally the diagnosis was thought that you had to have a great fear that your life was going to end. And over time, we've realized that lesser traumas can also cause post-traumatic stress disorder.
Is it possible that one can experience trauma in his life without developing post-traumatic stress disorder?
Yes. The interesting feature about post-traumatic stress disorder is that not everyone who undergoes even a life-threatening trauma develops post-traumatic stress disorder. Some people are extremely resilient and can be exposed to combat repeatedly and never develop post-traumatic stress disorder. Another example is even for people who witness a murder, only 1/4 of them will experience post-traumatic stress disorder from having witnessed something as horrific as a murder.
But witnessing a murder or participating in a murder, could that in and of itself cause post-traumatic stress disorder?
Even if you were the person that caused the horrific event, you can develop post-traumatic stress disorder from that.
And Dr. Wolfe, what are the symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder?
So essentially, whatever the trauma is, the person becomes sort of hypersensitized to it. So again, in the example of, let's just say an Iraqi vet. So if the Iraqi veteran had been driving in Iraq and constantly on guard, looking for an explosive device on the side of the road, sometimes when they come back here, they remain hypervigilant when they're driving, meaning that they're constantly on edge, wondering if that piece of trash on the side of the road is actually an explosive device. So that sort of thing. So it's when the person gets really keyed up from things that you and I aren't keyed up from. It can cause nightmares. It can cause significant irritability because it takes a big toll on the body to constantly be keyed up and on edge and looking for danger when there isn't really any there. And so they develop significant insomnia and nightmares, and then moodiness and irritability again, because then their sleep is disrupted.
And we've heard words like disassociation. What does that mean?
Well, disassociation means that you're separating yourself from your environment, and that in of itself is not diagnostic of anything. Women who have childbirth classes, natural childbirth classes, are taught Lamaze. That's an element where you're disassociating yourself from the pain. So it can be normal. It's more of a variation of hypnosis. Dissociation, when it becomes a dissociative disorder as a feature of post-traumatic stress disorder, is a much more severe condition.
And what are the symptoms of that, or what do you look for if you're looking for disassociation?
Well, again, I'll use the combat veterans as an example. So let's just say you have a combat veteran who had been to Vietnam, and sometimes when the weather conditions are just right and reminiscent of the high humidity, the high heat, and perhaps even the geographical, heavy, dense forest, sometimes these veterans all of a sudden view themselves as being there, and they're disassociating. They're picturing themselves in Vietnam as opposed to being, let's say, North Carolina.
And when they, in your particular example, try to recount what happened when they are in this dissociative state, are they able to recount details surrounding what they're in or what they've witnessed?
Environment, they're usually perceiving a slightly altered environment, and they're thinking of something usually very different. So they're not responding in a normal fashion. I've evaluated some people that were shooting the cable guy in the front yard, but it was a veteran who thought that he was in Korea and he was shooting the enemy. So sometimes the event doesn't make sense, but the person tells you what was going on. So sometimes it can be a flashback where they're suddenly picturing themselves there, and sometimes it's more of a separation from himself.
On the day of the defendant's arrest and the next day, the defendant gave statements to law enforcement about the murders of Jerome and Dora Faulkner. Did you review those statements?
I did.
And describe generally what you noted about those statements that the defendant gave to law enforcement on January the 1st to Detective Baker and January 2nd to Detective McPhee and Detective Hayes.
In general, the report spoke to following his father through the woods, looking for a camping spot, and being yelled at, told to come into the house, and at some point in time assisting with disposing the bodies.
And in the statements that he gave, and I would draw your attention to, in your report, if you have it in front of you, pages 50 and 51, or the details of the statement you actually noted in pages 37 through 45. First, with the statement to what you have noted as to West Virginia police, was the defendant detailed in what he told to Detective Baker on that day?
Yes, there were quite a few details in that statement.
Was he able to talk about the events leading up to going into the Faulkner's home?
Yes, I mean, he spoke of waking up in South Carolina that morning. Detectives pointed out that he was being vague in the statement, but he did provide some details, and spoke of ending up parking in his driveway because he pulled the car up in his driveway, that he spoke of his father driving the vehicle, and he wanted him to drive off the roads just left and right. He spoke of looking at little houses on the side, picking out this house and telling him to pull on the next road. Told him to go up a little street into the forest and parking there and grabbing a sprayer that was a backpack with a hose and a nozzle and a pump on top. And he sprayed it into this guy's eyes.
Did he talk about knowing what his father's intentions were?
There were a lot of different versions of this event, so it's hard for me to recall at this second, so I need a moment to refresh my memory.
Sure.
I put a summary of his statement in my report, so I don't see that there's a comment about anybody's intent in here. They're just details about what happened.
So I would draw your attention, Dr. Wolfe, to the bottom of page 39. And there's a sentence that said, he said his father stopped at Home Depot. And if you could read from there.
Okay. He said his father stopped at Home Depot and bought a sprayer and stuff. He said he was going to put lye into it and threaten them with it. Eric Campbell acknowledged that when they came into South Carolina, his father had already told him that they were going to find a house to rob. He was going to get money from somebody by impersonating the person and stealing their identity. He was going to threaten the person with the sprayer. He said that his father was going to threaten them by spraying that in his eyes.
And did he talk about how the house was chosen?
He was asked how the house was chosen, and he said by random, just picked it. We picked it by he'd look at their vehicle, look at their house, and he'd pick an older person.
And continue?
He said when he had driven by, he saw the guy check his mailbox before sunset, around 4 o'clock. Eric said he was driving the vehicle at the time. Eric Campbell said there was a tree on the side.
And then does he go on to give details about what he saw? Well, just if you will continue to read the next paragraph.
He said that he had a crossbow in his hand and a gun. He asked the guy to come inside, and he started spraying him in the face. Eric Campbell said, I thought he was going to rob them. He was asked about the lie, the crossbow, and the spear. He said that his father said, I'm going to rob it. He said that he wanted to get the money out of them. He said his father said, I want to get as much money as I can out of them. He said he heard his father start to spray them and heard him scream. Eric maintained that his father was going to rob them. He was confronted several times about the weapons and maintained that his father was going to rob the people and did not specify that he was going to kill them.
And he acknowledged that he was with his father during this time, isn't that correct?
Yes.
And did these statements indicate to you any impairment in the defendant's memory?
No.
And drawing your attention specifically to page 51 in your report, why do you say that?
Like I mentioned yesterday, there was a vague but sufficiently detailed account of the versions, and this crime was unusual in the number of weapons used. So there were 6 different weapons used in this crime. This wasn't a 5-minute thing. This actually lasted over several hours. So that was 2 things that were going on that were different. And his account of it was consistent with the pathologist's report. So it was, an awareness of all the different weapons used. It was an awareness of the purpose. There were comments that the father spoke of torturing the victims in order to get the PIN number. Talking about telling the woman, the female victim, make it easy on yourself and, give this information. So it's his recounting of these types of details that told me that his memory for that was reasonably intact.
And is this consistent, are these actions that the defendant took consistent with someone that was experiencing a triggering event because of post-traumatic stress disorder?
In my opinion, no.
And why do you say that?
Well, he might have experienced some horrifying feelings about having seen people get killed, but again, it's post-traumatic stress disorder, meaning that it wouldn't have been present during this particular time. So it could be that this particular night is going to give him some nightmares and mess up his sleep, but I do not believe that he would have had it at that time. Again, it's post-traumatic stress disorder. It's not disorder at the time of the offense.
And so with the actions that the defendant described and that he took when he talked to Detective Baker and talked to Detective McPhee, did you note this as being consistent with a dissociative episode?
There was no indication in these reports of a dissociative episode.
And why do you say that?
Again, because the information that he spoke of was consistent with the physical evidence and other information that was gathered from the crime scene.
Is this consistent with someone who is frozen with fear?
Not in my opinion.
And why do you say that?
There was evidence of his participation in this. Mr. Campbell reported to me that he spent 2 or 3 hours looking through the financials because that's what his father told him to do. But looking through financials is very complicated. It's a task where you have to have focus and attention on detailed information that requires a lot of cognitive processing, and he did that for several hours.
And in your opinion, does this show an intentional plan?
Yes, the, going to someone's home with 2 bags of weapons is a plan.
Did the statements that you noted and that you reviewed that were given to law enforcement different from the statements that the defendant gave to you when you interviewed him?
Yes, there were several changes over time.
Interviewed the defendant in March of 2017. How would you characterize the statement that he gave to you then?
The statement he gave me was, again, vague, with even fewer details or acknowledgement of what had occurred. But when I pushed him to have him describe to me what was going on inside the house, he did give an account that Mr. Faulkner was still on the bed when he was in the bedroom, that the woman was next to him, that at some point each of them had a bolt in their chest or abdomen, and that he saw Mr. Faulkner before the bag being placed over his head. At some later time, Mr. Faulkner's body was on the ground and the wife was still on the bed. So this is what he reported to me.
What about in his May interview with you? Which you referred to on page 20 of your report.
Well, in addition to the parties on the bed, he said he recalled blood pooling. He did not recall when the bag had been put on over the man's head, but that the man did not have the bag on his head when he was sitting on the bed. He reported that the woman was on the bed after the man had already fallen off. He recalled seeing his father's arm swinging. He said that the scuba knife did not get used. He said that the telescope was never used. He reported that his father had put water in the sprayer the day before when he went to walk the mile perimeter around the truck trying to find a good place to camp. He said they were trespassing, so he wanted to set up the camp where nobody would be bothered. He said, you make a circle around to make sure that nobody's around. He said that there were people using the abandoned house as a hunting ground, the one across the Faulkners, and he denied that they had been observing Faulkner's house.
And his description of getting to the home, was that different than what he had told law enforcement the day or about 18 hours after this crime occurred?
The description of getting to the home seemed to change every time I asked him, but the gist of it is that he gave this a long account of parking 2 miles away, running through the woods for over 30 minutes and having difficulty following his father. Then suddenly a home appeared and his father went on the back deck and he followed him.
And that was different from what he gave to law enforcement, wasn't it?
Yes, it was.
In fact, he told law enforcement that they went straight to the Faulkner's home after they packed these bags up. Isn't that correct?
Yes.
What, if anything, did you note or notice other than the inconsistencies about the statements that the defendant gave to you? Specifically about his ability to take responsibility.
There was a distinctive pattern of minimizing any type of behavior that he had. It was from not knowing that there was lye in the sprayer. So he was able to attend to small details after the crime, like knowing that they had used the Faulkner's credit card for gas, even though he wasn't the one who paid for it. But yet, other details before that he was extremely vague about. So again, that more inconsistencies. And again, this is not consistent with a mental disorder.
What is it more consistent with?
Somebody who is changing their story of their own volition.
Did the defendant tell you anything about driving himself and his father to Walmart after the Faulkners were murdered?
There was no mention of a trip to Walmart.
Did you find that out from any collateral source?
I did.
And what did you find out, or what did you learn about that?
I learned that there was a video of the white car that was taken from the Walmart parking lot right shortly before midnight, and that car sat there for 10 minutes. During that time, his father was purchasing large bins and some beer, and again, there was a 10-minute shot of the car in the parking lot.
And did the defendant acknowledge that to you? Did you ask him about that particular time when he sat in the Walmart parking lot?
I didn't know about the Walmart parking lot, and anytime I attempted to ask him about details, he was very quick to say, I don't know. But driving, again, requires an ability to process, information. You're driving, you're performing goal-directed activity, and so driving to a Walmart and back indicates some, again, level of awareness. And furthermore, one of the other items purchased was lamps, and there was a power failure. So again, it's adapting to the environment. So adapting to the environment, again, is another sign that the person is aware of their circumstances and is altering their behavior as a result.
Lamps, of course, would be required to look through financial records in the house in the case of a power outage.
Yes, they would.
In addition to assessing the mental state at the actual time of the event, so the night of December 31st, did you also look at the activities and the behavior of the defendant around the time of the offense?
Well, I did, because looking only at New Year's Eve gives a very small glimmer into the behavior that was going on. I thought it was extremely important to back it up by 1 week or two to figure out what was going on in Texas before this whole trip to North Carolina.
And why was that important to you?
Again, to see if there were any changes in his mental state, if there was something going on. Why come to North Carolina?
And did you notice any indications from the information that the defendant gave you and the collateral information that you reviewed that the defendant was participating or at least aiding his father in criminal activity in Texas?
Well, certainly the jail phone calls were indicative of people working on a plan. There was mention in the jail calls about Fodor's Guide to something like South America, which is a hint perhaps at leaving the country. So there's information there about looking for Holly, and those are just, again, elements that I observed, nothing illegal about any of that. But when there's a lot of vagary about where his father wasn't supposed to be at the house on Indian Acres. He also said that that Nick didn't want him at his apartment, but then he didn't say where was his father during this time. And then on the 18th, so 10 days later, when he's supposed to go to court, is the event that he had talked about taking him to the woods in this park in Texas. And then after that is the time where he was detected because of his cell phone, the father was. And then going to pick him up, at some point having these margaritas by a campfire, and he described that as a jovial event, again, not consistent with somebody who's horrified of his father, and having a good time, again, having alcoholic beverages. And then again, there's just vagary about where is he for the next 6 days? And it's very unclear. There's like this gap of information. But very relevantly, on the 24th of December, so 6 days out and the day that they leave, Mr. Eric Campbell is actually stopped by law enforcement who's looking for his father and specifically questioned about his father's whereabouts. And he denies any knowledge of it, but he's been working on this packing list and this car. So again, the list and the fact that these items have been crossed off indicates somebody's been working on this list, and it just so happens that this list and what's been crossed off is what shows up in the car. So again, a lot of activity involved ahead of time in Texas.
And when you say packing list, Dr. Wolfe, I'm drawing your attention to the screen to State's Exhibit 451. Is this the list that you're referring to?
Yes, it is.
And did you see this, or at least a picture of it, in your preparation or in putting together your evaluation?
Yes, I did.
And did you ask the defendant about this?
At this moment in time, I don't recall what I asked him. Just a moment, please.
Certainly.
I found my section on page 17. He said that his father gave him a list of things to pick up, including camping gear, a sleeping bag, suits, a blanket, dress shirts, a tarp, a telescope, warm clothing, and weapons that were in the house. So he picked up a bow, medieval weaponry, a dull sword, and a crossbow from the house.
And the defendant was able to tell you and to recall what was on the list and the things that he had actually packed in the car. Isn't that correct?
This is what he reported packing to me, yes.
And is that consistent with what you see on this list here in State's Exhibit 451?
Some of the items are consistent, but there's several other items on this list that weren't mentioned that are peculiar items to pack for a camping trip.
What specifically?
Well, let me take a look at it again.
And if you need to reposition yourself, Dr. Wolfe, I believe that's going to be okay.
Well, so for the first item, duct tape, eyeglasses, including broken ones, nurse uniforms, telescope, silicone molding, plastic, tire compressor, paint, airbrush, a dry suit for cold weather, meaning a diving equipment. So those are some unusual items to pack for a 2-day camping trip.
And being able to take a list, go through a home, find these items, mark them off a list, is this consistent with someone who is in the stages of some sort of post-traumatic stress disorder or triggering event?
No.
Someone who is suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder?
Well, somebody can be suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder, any day, but even if they have post-traumatic stress disorder, it doesn't stop them from going through a list and putting these items in a car and having some awareness of each of these items' functions.
And did you note another list, State's Exhibit 408? Did you see this, or at least a picture of this list in
I did.
preparing?
Yes, I did.
And what did this indicate to you?
So again, these are more items that were, speaking of the nursing uniform, for his father had been a nurse but had lost his license years earlier, and plaster, alginate, and the name John Hilson, John Hillman next to it. I think some of these are repeated items.
And
I think there were zip ties in there somewhere too.
And I'll draw your attention to State's Exhibit 409. Did you look at this, which is, I believe, the back of State's 408, in preparing for this, during your evaluation?
I did.
And did you note anything specifically on this? What was noted there?
So what's written there is, what did we discuss up there in the forest? Specifics and basic plan.
Did you ask the defendant about that?
Mr. Campbell was very consistently vague anytime I tried to point out details.
So was he consistently vague when you asked him about the specifics that were discussed, or did you specifically ask him about that sentence?
I don't think I specifically asked about this particular sentence. It was just, again, I'd gone through the scenario several times, and it was difficult to get information. Many of his responses were, "I don't know." I did specifically ask about purchasing of the lye at the Home Depot, and again, there was some comment he made to me of he didn't know those were going to be used on anybody, but again, that differed from the statements that he gave to law enforcement. It also isn't consistent with purchasing goggles and gloves a few hours later.
So while the defendant was still in Texas, you indicated that you noted interaction with law enforcement on December the 24th. You read information from Jose Reveles, the law enforcement officer, is that correct?
That is correct.
And I think you indicated that the defendant acknowledged that he had seen law enforcement on that day, is that correct?
I don't recall him ever acknowledging that he spoke to law enforcement that day. Relevant because this is a time that Eric Campbell is by himself. There's nobody there by himself. There's nobody there who is in the car. It's just him speaking to law enforcement. So there's no pressure on him. This is, don't know where he is.
And did the defendant talk to you at all about cell phone use or him using or taking a cell phone with him on this particular trip?
I did specifically ask about the cell phones, especially why a guy who's almost 22 years old would leave his cell phone behind.
And what did he say to you?
That his father had him take the phone, his flip phone out and put it into the back of the car that they were leaving in the parking lot when they took the white Suburban.
Did he talk to you about any other means of communication? Did he talk about walkie-talkies? Did he talk about any other communication?
He did not bring up walkie-talkies. I saw the walkie-talkies on a list of evidence, and I specifically asked him about walkie-talkies, and he said that they didn't use them because one of them was broken. He also added that he didn't want to speak to his father, so he was glad it was broken.
And once the defendant and his father left Texas, did he indicate to you that he knew his dad was stealing license tags along the way?
He did speak of that.
And what did he say?
He spoke of having great anxiety when he realized that his father was changing the license plates on the car.
And what did he do about that anxiety, and did he tell you where that came from?
If you could refer me to where you are in my report.
Well, I guess specifically, or generally, what did he tell you about the license tags?
Well, he mentioned, like I said yesterday, that he didn't know what a stolen car looked like, and again spoke of this, great anxiety that his father was changing these plates. Where he said that first he didn't know what his father was doing; that his father would just go to the back of the car and then toss a license tag out of the window. Which again seemed inconsistent. I mean, he knew leaving Texas that his father was a wanted fugitive, that he was supposed to be in court for the severe aggravated assault on the stepmom, Holly Campbell. And if anything, changing the license plate makes them less visible to law enforcement. So it was again inconsistent with, as it was an inconsistent report in my mind.
Did the defendant ever identify a specific route that they took from Texas?
He identified several different routes, but usually it was incredibly vague. Like, my father told me to go west, then go east, and I just wanted to go to a national park. We were supposed to go camping.
And did he mention to you anything about going through Atlanta?
No, he did not.
Did he mention in any other reports that you read about going to Atlanta?
I did read about the trip to Atlanta, getting all dressed up and going out, yes.
What, if anything, did you note, or what did that indicate to you?
Again, another indicator of socializing with his father. Getting dressed up, having drinks, going to a club.
And you indicated, or at least you talked about, the visit to Home Depot. Is that correct?
Yes.
Did the defendant tell you that he went to Home Depot?
I would have to refer to my report to know exactly what he told me, but there was, again, minimizing the impact of the purchases.
And did you view a video from Home Depot during your preparation or during your evaluation?
I did.
I'm referring you now to State's Exhibit 158, if you can take a look at that.
Yes, this is the video that I viewed.
And do you note anything about the defendant in this particular video?
So the defendant in this video is the one with the black cap, and again, the behavior is quite unremarkable. There's attention to what's being placed in the basket, and later at the cash register, he has a very casual demeanor.
Is this consistent with someone who is in a dissociative episode?
No, it is not.
Someone who is exhibiting the symptoms of hypervigilance?
No.
Frozen with fear?
No.
Do you note anything about the items that were purchased?
I can't tell from this video, but I know there's an associated receipt.
And I will show you what's marked as State's Exhibit 159. And do you recognize, or did you look at this?
I did. I can't read it from here, though.
That's fine, and we will zoom in on it.
Yeah, it's the lighter fluid, drain opener, padlock, U-bolt, things like that.
And did you ask Eric Campbell about these purchases?
I did.
And what did he say?
He didn't know what they were going to be used for, or that they were going to be used to make methamphetamine.
Did the defendant explain or tell you that he knew how to make methamphetamines?
Yes, he did.
Was he pretty specific in that?
He was able to name a large number of chemicals. What I thought was interesting is that he threw in some additional chemicals that are not known to make methamphetamine, including the muriatic acid. And then the other items that they didn't have, such as lithium and Sudafed, weren't mentioned. Lithium and Sudafed are required to make methamphetamine.
Did he explain the padlocks or the chains or the U-bolts?
No.
And Dr. Wolfe, after they, the receipt shows that they were in Greenville, South Carolina at the Home Depot on December the 28th, did you know about a receipt that showed any purchases from Walmart in Kannapolis?
Yes.
And that's what the state is showing there. Did you look at this?
Yes.
And what did you notice was purchased?
I believe that's the gloves and goggles.
Did
If you could blow it up, I could read it for sure, but I believe that's what the items are. Yes, so water, gloves, and goggles.
Did you ask the defendant specifically about this?
No.
And why not?
Again, I was already getting so many vague responses. I could not ask him about every single thing.
In the defendant's statement to Dr. Chaudhry, he mentioned that his dad had intentions to look for Holly when they left Texas, that he believed he would kill her. What does this, did he mention anything to you about that?
No, specifically, there's no mention of looking for Holly. Again, unlike what was heard in the jail recordings and in Dr. Chaudhry's report, actually it wasn't in her report, it was mentioned in her notes, not in her actual typed report. But that is what's missing in his account of these stories is what they were doing in Hillsborough all this time. There's evidence through receipts that there were 2 to 3 days spent in Hillsborough. When I asked him about it, it was we just moved the car from one part of a parking lot to another with virtually no detail of any activity during the day. But there's definitely no mention of Holly. I specifically asked about Mr. Hilson's home because there was the passports that were taken from his home were one of the items retrieved in the vehicle. And he said that he just saw the stack of passports in the back of the car, had no idea how they got there. And there, again, was no mention of Holly, and the home that these passports came from was the home of Holly's friend from Canada from years and years, her male friend from Canada.
And was the defendant, was he ever, or did he ever give you any details about those 3 days that they were in Hillsborough?
Again, superficial details, like we went to the library, I didn't really look at anything, Dad looked at the computer, things like that.
Is there any reason, in your opinion, to have any significant memory impairment about what was going on in Hillsborough?
No.
And why do you say that?
Again, this is a pattern that he's exhibited, and he didn't mention being threatened by his father at any time. We actually have video of purchasing of the harsh chemicals. There's no time when he's reporting that he was in fear of his life from his father.
So no...
Before the actual murders.
So no triggering event or trauma that's reported in Hillsborough?
Correct.
But he can't remember what's going on? Or tells you that?
He just said he didn't know.
After the Faulkners are murdered, there were 2 videos, a Kangaroo Express video and a Sheets video. And I know it's indicated in your report that you viewed the Kangaroo Express video. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Were you able to view the Sheets video?
I think that was the one that I couldn't get to open.
And on the Kangaroo surveillance, the Kangaroo Express surveillance video, what, if anything, did you notice? Did you see the defendant in that video?
I did.
And what did you notice about him?
That he attempted to conceal his face.
And what, if anything, did that say to you, or why did you find that important?
Again, it indicates an awareness of the circumstances and also attempting to avoid identification.
Is that an ability or an awareness of your surroundings?
It's awareness of your circumstances as well, yes. Because if you look at the other videos, he's not concealing his face in the Home Depot.
And did you ask him at all about, why he didn't say anything to anybody or why he didn't alert anybody when he went into the Kangaroo or when he was away from his father?
He gave a general indication that he was following his father's instructions. I specifically talked to him about the map, about what was the map supposed to be, and he just said he didn't know, but he had purchased the wrong one and then went back into the store and got another one that must have been to his father's satisfaction. So again, it's somebody who has an awareness of the circumstances and is able to take in the information and change their behavior as a result.
Did you notice that he was talking and interacting with people on the video in the Kangaroo Express?
Yes.
That he said good morning to folks, talked to them about where he was going?
Yes.
Is that consistent with someone who is suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder?
Well, again, somebody with even severe post-traumatic stress disorder can obviously say good morning, but it's not consistent with somebody who doesn't know where he is or is frozen.
And as a part of your review in this evaluation, did you watch a video of a traffic stop from West Virginia?
I did.
I'm going to show you what's been marked and admitted as State's Exhibit Number 1. Is this the video that you viewed, Dr. Wolfe?
Yes, it is.
Dr. Wolfe, did you talk to the defendant about following his father, or whether there was some sort of pattern or signal that they had between the two of them?
I did. I asked him how was he supposed to know where to go, and he said that they had a pattern of, because I said since he said the walkie-talkies were not working, that he was supposed to tap the brakes twice to indicate a stop.
And the defendant understood that that was the pattern, is that correct? Or at least that's what he told you?
That's what he told me, yes.
Which way they want to, we're going to be just part of the fight. Can you verify that this is a stolen plate, please? Come on back here. They must be traveling together. Come on back here for a second. Anybody else in the Suburban? Anybody else in the Suburban? Anyone else in the Suburban? Come on back here.
What do you notice, if anything, about this interaction?
He's able to follow the instructions, so again, he has an awareness of the circumstances and is able to respond to those circumstances. The other thing is that we can see that he's, aware that he's being pulled over, that there was a police officer behind him, and he pulled over.
Is this consistent with someone who is in the middle of an episode or a dissociative episode under extreme hypervigilance, frozen with fear because of post-traumatic stress disorder?
No. In fact, this is just a few hours after the murders, and his demeanor is pretty unremarkable. It looks like a routine traffic stop.
Stop here before you get hit by a car. Come on here. Come on. Your license plate is reported stolen. I'm sorry? Your license plate is reported. It's in NCIC. What do you know that's being reported stolen? It was reported as being stolen. The license plate, there's a camera that reads license plate. License plate has been reported as being stolen. Have you ever had a license plate stolen and reported? No. Does the tell me your name or your name? Come on over here where I can hear everybody. Who's the registered owner of this? Right here.
So, you viewed this video before.
I did.
Would someone's father standing beside them opening fire on someone else be a traumatic event?
Yes.
And what did you note that the defendant did at that particular time?
Well, let me back up for a little moment. It's, again, the type of behavior that he's demonstrated throughout. The officer confronts him about this stolen tag, which he's talked about repeatedly, and he's like, what do you mean? That's the typical response that I've been getting. So he had an awareness of the tag being stolen, but again, it's that pattern of evasiveness. That's not post-traumatic stress disorder speaking. That's a choice to be evasive in your conversation. So again, this act is relevant because he doesn't go back into his car. He actually goes into the other car where all the evidence is. The dead bodies and all the other stuff is in the front car. And he said that his father always taught him to leave the keys in the ignition in the car running.
And so do you find it, the fact that he ran to the truck as opposed to the Suburban, characteristic of the fact that he had no idea what he was doing?
It didn't seem consistent to me. I mean, to me, this was taking the worst evidence and trying to get away and trying to get rid of it.
Did the defendant tell you what he did after he drove away in the truck?
Yes. He said that he drove down the road and if I can refresh my memory, because again, I've read so many different accounts of what he said that I'm mixing them up at the moment.
Sure. I can draw your attention to at least your summation of it on page 55.
He told me that he did not know what he was doing. He parked the car into the ditch and kept going. And he told me that all the stuff was in his jacket. And specifically, we had talked about the pink purse and these jewels that were jewelry that was later recovered, and the gun. So at first I had wondered, well, how small was this purse, and is it one of those small ladies' purses that could actually fit in somebody's pocket? So I actually came up to look at the purse and saw that it was a good-sized purse that obviously was not fitting in a pocket.
And what did he other things that he had taken and, as he said, put in his jacket?
He said he just didn't know what he was doing.
And did he indicate, so did he say he knew what he actually did with those things? Did he tell you that he had buried them in the woods?
No.
And when you looked at the evidence, and did you review pictures from the West Virginia wood line?
I did.
And I'm showing you what's been marked as State's Exhibit 98. Did you look at that picture?
I did.
And was this the pocketbook that you actually viewed?
Yes.
And was it big enough to fit in someone's, was it small enough, to fit in someone's pocket?
Absolutely not.
And did you view State's Exhibit 53?
Yes, I did.
And what did you notice about this particular picture?
Well, this is a set of pictures, but this is the hollowed-out tree that the Faulkner's gold jewels and other belongings are in. But what I thought was interesting was that, that he managed to find a tree branch to actually fit over this to make it look like a natural tree and cover up the gold.
And when you say a set of pictures, did you look at all of the pictures from the West Virginia wood line?
I did.
And what stood out to you about that series of pictures?
Well, what stood out to me is that the car crashed sort of in a valley, and that these items are up at the top of a hill, and that the initial pictures of the scene look rather untouched. The leaves are untouched. You can't tell that there's a whole lot of walking that's been going through there. And again, even where the gun was buried, there's a leaf pattern over it to conceal where these items have been hidden very effectively.
And did you confront the defendant with that information?
I don't recall.
And did he mention anything to you about a gun in the West Virginia wood line?
He did.
And what did he say about it?
He said that his father had put the gun in his pocket, and he thought about using it to commit suicide and then using a rock to smash it.
And I'm showing you what's on the screen now, States 101. Do you see that?
I do.
And I believe Sergeant Wade testified that there was a rock over this gun Did you view pictures of the gun, and have you viewed the gun?
I have.
And did you notice any smash markings on the gun?
I did not.
What is these items of evidence and the way that they're laid out, is this consistent with someone who is in a dissociative episode?
Well, it's not consistent with somebody who's in a dissociative episode, but concealing evidence is something that we use very strongly in a forensic psychiatric evaluation because it speaks, again, to the person's mental state, having that awareness of what happened and avoiding apprehension. So this is another example, and what's relevant about this one is that this is during a time when it's only him. His father's not right there. This is only Eric Campbell acting on this.
Does this show the ability to make decisions?
Yes.
The ability to think intentionally?
Yes.
To set a goal and make a decision to take you to that particular goal?
I believe it does, yes.
And if you don't meet one particular goal, start afresh and make a new goal?
Yes.
I would draw your attention, Dr. Wolfe, to pages 56 and 57 of your report, starting in the second paragraph in 2014. Are you beginning in your report here to talk about the defendant's diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder?
Yes.
And tell the jury or talk to them about his ability to live independently and the things that he was doing in 2014 before this occurred.
Like I mentioned yesterday, I looked very carefully at what Mr. Campbell was doing the months and years prior to this event. And in 2014, like I said, he had ended this 3-year relationship with his girlfriend Chloe that summer. But that summer, he'd also gone out of the country to Canada to go work in these Spartan races, building in a team where he had been described as having leadership skills and doing very good work. He came back, had another job with an employer who also commended him on his work ability, and he did good workmanship, got along well with others. That particular employer also noted that Eric had been anxious to get his father out of jail, which again speaks to some eagerness on his part. He had also been attending, and again, going back to the community college. So there were lots of very normal activities during that time. There's also a lack of any mental health treatment, any mental health concerns noted during that time, and specifically his best friend spoke about him having only seen Eric depressed for 4 days, and that was after the breakup with Chloe.
And did you note, and do you have any thoughts or opinions regarding the defendant's diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder?
Well, I noted that there was no history of treatment for post-traumatic stress disorder or depression prior to his arrest. There's been a lot said about whether or not he was abused. There's a lot of conflicting reports about what was going on in the home for the 10 years prior to that. So I considered that his version of events may be entirely accurate, for diagnostic purposes, let's say that they are 100% what Eric is asserting, but you have to have other symptoms to go along with it. So again, it's not just exposure to trauma, it's the consequences of your body not being able to handle that trauma. And there's no one who described him as being hypervigilant, no one who described him being irritable, no one who said he dissociated, no one who said he had a flashback, no one who described periods of insomnia or significant mood problems. So again, these are all features that people who have post-traumatic stress have. He may well have had a terrible childhood, but it does not mean that he had post-traumatic stress disorder. So I do not believe that he actually had the diagnosis at that time.
you note on page 57, you say regardless of the diagnosis, if PTSD is legitimate or malingered. So did you view this, all of these, all of what you considered in light of the fact that he may have post-traumatic stress disorder?
Yes.
And what was your opinion as to that issue, as to whether that was important or not?
Well, again, it speaks to, was there a psychiatric diagnosis at the time of the offense? So even giving him the benefit of the doubt and saying that he has been exposed to all this trauma, again, you have to have some behavioral evidence and manifestations of symptoms, and that really are not apparent. So for years and years and years, there's no functional impairment. And again, there was no report, even when he went to the doctor, there's no report of any type of mood disturbance or anxiety. And these are questions that actually were asked.
Asked by
Professionals.
whom the defendant saw in his past.
Yes.
And Dr. Wolfe, what is your opinion as to the defendant's mental state at the time the Faulkners were murdered?
Well, there's no evidence that he was not able to understand the nature and quality of the act, meaning what was the purpose of the behavior and what was going on. Having an understanding that a crossbow in somebody's abdomen is going to hurt. He had an awareness that stabbing somebody in the neck could be fatal. Having somebody get shot in the leg is going to be painful and could be fatal. So again, there's all these awareness of the lethality of these weapons. Spraying lye into somebody's face is going to be very harmful.
Is it your opinion that the activity that he described consistently demonstrates his pattern of goal-directed volition behavior?
Well, what he describes and what occurred may not be the same thing, but the behavior that was described in the house was goal-directed in terms of even the part he acknowledges, which is getting the Faulkners' bodies into the truck, is goal-directed activity.
And drawing your attention to page 57 of your report, you say his behaviors on the night of the offense suggest knowledge of wrongfulness. Is that your opinion?
Yes, it is.
And you go on to describe that. Can you say under that how you get to that opinion, or how you, let me ask you, is it your opinion that the defendant could have formed the specific intent to murder the Faulkners?
Yes.
And is it your opinion that the defendant could have formed the specific intent to rob or plan to rob the Faulkners?
Yes, I'm saying that he doesn't have a mental disorder that prevented him from doing any of these things.
And do you hold this opinion to a medical or psychiatric certainty?
I hold it to a reasonable degree of medical certainty. Yes, I do.
And you obviously recorded all of these findings in a report. Is that correct?
I did.
May I approach, Your Honor?
Yes, ma'am.
Dr. Wolfe, I'm showing you what I've marked in State's Exhibit 645. Do you recognize that, ma'am?
I do.
And what is it?
This is my 58-page forensic psychiatric evaluation of Mr. Eric Campbell.
Your Honor, the State would move to admit State's Exhibit 645.
Yes, sir. Motion to induce and amplify.
I don't have anything further.
Witness,
Dr. Wolfe, you do not rule out the possibility of post-traumatic stress disorder, do you?
Definitely not.
And you were here yesterday when a couple of jail calls were played, were you not?
I was.
And you heard his father speaking on those jail calls.
I did.
And he was a very assertive person, isn't that correct?
It sounded like it,
He's a
yes.
very aggressive person, isn't he?
Yes.
And now, you reviewed the history of this case as a whole, didn't you?
I tried my best.
Well, did you review the information about Eric Campbell's mother's aneurysm?
Yes.
And did you review the information about his sister's death?
Yes.
Did you review the information about the Department of Social Services, the Child Protective Service investigations?
Yes.
And of course, you reviewed the autopsies in this case.
Yes.
And the connection between all of those events was Edward Campbell, isn't that fair to say? That's one of the connections, isn't it?
Yes.
Now, I want to talk to you specifically about some of the ways you characterize your conversations with Eric Campbell. You characterized it as evasive, is that right, at times?
He was evasive during our conversations.
Well, you had 3 conversations with him, is that true? Three very long interviews?
Those were the recorded ones, and again, there was that hour-and-a-half one.
Is that where you asked him to answer questions in written form?
No, where you're observing the person, also asking them about their mood, their sleep, their appetite, any things that are going on at that time. Is he hearing voices, seeing things? Is he oriented? Things like that.
And that's the one that was not recorded, is that right?
Correct.
Now, in that interview, did you get into the actual substance of this case, or did you, I mean, I know that it's all substantive in some way, but did you get into, was it mostly about the background and biography, or did you start talking about the events?
I don't believe that we talked of any substantial amount about the event on that day.
Now, you talked a little bit about Mr. Campbell's background, is that right?
Yes.
And you were aware of the diagnosis at Central Prison, is that right, at some point?
Yes.
And you were aware that Dr. O'Connell diagnosed him with post-traumatic stress disorder, chronic?
Yes.
And you were aware that Dr. Newman diagnosed him with chronic post-traumatic stress disorder?
Yes.
And Dr. Straw agreed with that diagnosis, is that right?
I don't recall his name on there, but there were hundreds of pages, so I don't doubt that Dr. Straw would have been one of them.
And the chronic type was based on chronic, or the history of childhood abuse, is that right?
That's correct.
Now, you said there was inconsistent history of that. Is that right? Or
Yes.
inconsistent reports?
Yes.
Now, but you are aware that it was reported that Child Protective Services was involved.
Yes.
And there are plenty of times when children are actually abused without Child Protective Service being involved, isn't that right?
Absolutely.
And Child Protective Services was involved on at least 2 occasions, is that right?
That is correct.
And one of those occasions resulted in them being removed from the home.
That's correct.
And then, and that was on one of those, and in both of those situations, there was at least some question as to whether Mr. Campbell was being abusive to the children, is that right?
My recall is that one of those events, Mr. Campbell had been arrested for assaulting his girlfriend, and there was no one to supervise. And another time, Mr. Campbell was passed out, and so there was a question about his ability to provide good parenting.
And both of those times, the children, or at least Eric Campbell, was 7 or 8 years old, is that right?
That's correct.
And those types of events can be traumatic to children, isn't that right?
Absolutely, yes, it can be traumatic.
I mean, that's not a good environment. You would not recommend that environment for a child, would you?
No, I mean, it's a negligent household.
Well, it could be more than negligent. It could be dangerous, couldn't it, Dr. Wolfe?
Absolutely, yes.
I mean, and in fact, the Child Protective Services were worried about substantial danger to the children, weren't they?
Yes, and they investigated it.
Now, and then they returned him to the home. Isn't that right?
Yes.
And did you hear the jail calls between Mr. Edward Campbell and his children?
I did not hear all of those calls.
Well, did you hear the jail calls where, that were played in court?
I heard the ones yesterday, yes.
You heard just the jail calls between Mr. Campbell and his sister?
I heard the ones yesterday, and I heard a couple of ones that were played last week.
And did you hear him calling himself the captain?
I don't specifically recall that.
Okay. Did you hear him call himself the boss?
I remember a man who was very loud and aggressive sounding.
And there's no reason to believe that in 2015, Mr. Edward Campbell's personality was substantially different than it was when the boys were children, is there?
Well, in 2015, there's a huge intervening event,
I'm
which
sorry,
is
not
his arrest for
2000. I
murder.
apologize. I'm talking about 2014 when the jail calls were recorded.
I'm sorry, ask your question again?
Well, there's no reason to believe the man on the other side of that phone was any different than he was earlier in Eric's life, is
Oh,
there?
you're talking about Mr. Edward Campbell.
Edward Campbell.
Oh, okay. No, there's no reason to believe that that's atypical of him.
Right. I mean, he was in trouble in Florida for drugs and lost his nursing license, isn't that right?
That's correct.
He was in trouble in Texas for drugs and lost his nursing license.
That is correct.
I mean, even Holly Campbell described him as angry and at least verbally abusive, didn't she?
Yes.
And she described him shooting a gun inside the house while their infant was sleeping, didn't she?
Yes.
That's a dangerous environment for a child, isn't it?
Absolutely.
And subjection to that type of environment can be traumatic, can't it?
Absolutely.
And continued subjection to that type of environment can cause serious trauma, can't it?
Absolutely.
Now, you talked about a traumatic event, but a traumatic series of events can compound the trauma and post-traumatic stress disorder, can't it?
Yes.
Now, in and of course, you know what the DSM, Diagnostic Statistical Manual 5 is that correct?
Yes.
And now there's actually a subtype of post-traumatic stress that's called dissociative type, is that right?
That is correct.
And aren't the dissociative symptoms more commonly seen in instances of people with their trauma is sexual abuse or childhood abuse?
Well, I was going to say it's more common in the people who've had sexual abuse.
Well, and they include in the DSM childhood sexual or physical abuse, domestic battery. Is that right?
If that's what it reads, absolutely.
Now, you mentioned yesterday as part of your consideration, Dr. Fox's test, is that right?
Yes.
Yes.
Tell you what way to get them to take on this house. Stop looking. Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to take our morning recess at this point. During this time, we continue not to talk among yourselves about this case. Continue not to talk to the parties, the witnesses, or the lawyers about anything at all. Further, continue not to talk to anyone else, to allow anyone else to talk with you the same thing in your presence about this case. If anyone communicates with you, says anything in your presence about this case, please let the sheriff know back when you return. Further, any individual research or investigation on your own about any issue touching on this trial, stay away from smartphones. Do not form us to raise some opinion about this case during this time. With that, will anyone else for remain seated? Tuesday, 17 of you asked that you return to the assembly of your room at 11:15 this morning. Again, we go by that clock. Thank you, Archie.
That's okay.
Okay.
Mr. Chair, if you may invite the jury. Dr. Wolfe, remain stand by oath to tell the truth and so help you defendant.
Thank you, Your Honor. May I approach, Your Honor?
Yes, sir.
I'm talking about phone hand, what's been marked as defense exhibit 51. Do you recognize that?
Yes,
Does that appear to be Dr. Fox's report?
It is.
Psychological testing. Now, when someone's doing an assessment at Central Regional Hospital, you're the primary sort of, under these circumstances, you're the primary contact. Is that right?
yes,
And so you ask for her assistance in this.
I did.
And she's a PhD psychologist, is that right?
That is correct.
And so you asked Dr. Fox, did you ask her to do these particular tests, or did you just ask her to answer these particular questions?
I asked her to do a psychological assessment with Mr. Campbell.
So you didn't tell her do this test or this test. That's sort of her specialty, is that right?
Yes,
And so one of the questions was, do a psychological evaluation to rule out feigning or exaggeration of psychological problems. Is that right?
yes,
And to assess personality traits and psychological function.
yes,
Is that right? So Dr. Fox decided to do, and I think you mentioned the SIRS, the SIRS test.
yes,
And that's a test particularly designed to determine if someone's malingering or exaggerating symptoms. Isn't that right?
symptoms of a mental illness, yes,
Well, and the symptoms are particularly related to physical or psychological conditions, right? For malingering. That's what the DSM says anyway.
right. This particular test is for feigning psychological symptoms, but especially psychosis.
And also, one of the questions she considered, or Dr. Fox considered with her testing, was a test to assess personality traits and psychological functioning. Isn't that right?
Yes,
And that was. You talked a little bit about the SIRS test, and I forgot exactly what you said, but the bottom line was, the way Dr. Fox phrased it was, these results suggest that Mr. Campbell was not attempting to feign psychological problems, including psychotic symptoms, on this measure. Isn't that right?
yes,
And so her conclusion was he was not making any efforts to exaggerate any sort of psychological symptoms.
on this test, correct.
On this test, and did she say he was feigning psychological symptoms on any other tests?
Well, she noted an inconsistency.
I'm sorry, you're saying
Well, for instance, on the MMPI, he endorsed symptoms of anxiety and depression, but didn't actually state them during the associated clinical interview.
right, he didn't go in whining about being depressed. He didn't say I'm depressed or anything, right?
No, he didn't. It's just another inconsistency that
Right,
you would expect that if somebody's telling you, I don't have any anxiety or depression, that they're also going to not endorse that on a test.
But you would be more concerned, wouldn't you, Dr. Wolfe, if someone goes in and is exaggerating psychological symptoms, wouldn't you?
I note all of it. I'm not particularly, I note all of it. So I
Right.
notice a discrepancy in symptoms over time, and also, again, during the same clinical interview, if somebody tells me they don't have something, but then they endorse it on the test, I'm giving them that same day, that's something else I consider.
Okay. But he basically said, I don't feel depressed on this particular day. Is that right? Or he didn't note particular symptoms associated with depression or anxiety at that time?
He did not endorse it during the clinical interview, but did endorse some, not to a malingered level, during the MMPI test, yes.
Okay. Well, let's talk about exactly what she says. And with the MMPI yesterday, when the prosecutor asked you, you mentioned anxiety and depression endorsement. Is that right?
Yes.
Now, in the second, on page 2, under the MMPI in her report, she says validity measures suggest that Mr. Campbell responded to these test items in a consistent manner. He did not approach the test with a tendency to minimize or exaggerate psychological problems, so the report was considered valid. Is that right?
Yes.
Now, and she does talk about elevated levels that would indicate some anxiety and depression, or feeling worried, apprehensive, and feel pessimistic about the future on the next page, doesn't she?
Yes.
She also talks about something called the PK scale, the T equals 70, doesn't she?
Yes.
And that's not something that you mentioned yesterday, is it, Dr. Wolfe?
No,
You didn't discuss that with this jury, did you?
I wouldn't, because I'm not a psychologist, and so this is beyond my expertise.
Well, I mean, through the state's lens, what he really endorses is depression and anxiety. Isn't that true, Dr. Wolfe? I mean, that's what you said yesterday. That was your interpretation of the test, right?
Actually, I do not interpret the test. That's what I'm trying to say. I just have Dr. Fox does that, and I have her conclusions. I do not do test interpretation.
The prosecutor asked you about this test yesterday, didn't she, Dr. Wolfe?
She asked me about the MMPI, yes.
And you gave her an explanation that there was some indication that he was anxious and depressed. Isn't that right?
Yes, from the summary and analysis section.
And in fact, on page 3, Dr. Fox's explanation under the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5th paragraph talks about the PK scale T equals 70, doesn't it?
Yes.
And some studies have shown positive correlations between high elevations on the PK scale and symptoms of post-traumatic stress, well, PTSD, although most of the research has focused on compact-related post-traumatic stress disorder. Is that right?
That's right.
And then she says there is accumulating evidence that scores on the PK scale are related to general distress. Is that right?
Yes.
Now, and so, in all fairness, Dr. Wolfe, that's another test that would certainly point toward there being a diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder, wouldn't it?
The MMPI alone doesn't specifically state that somebody has a diagnosis. These are diagnostic considerations. So does it point in that direction as a possibility? Yes.
And of course, that's something that you haven't ruled out overall, isn't that right?
Correct.
Now, I want to talk to you a little bit about some of the terminology and things that you have described as you've testified, Dr. Wolfe. If I can find my notes here. When you were first asked about your interviews with Eric Campbell, you described him as being vague. Is that right?
Yes.
And evasive. Is that
Yes.
right? And you said a lot of times he would say, I don't know. Is that right?
Yes.
And of course, but 2 out of your 3 interviews were recorded, weren't they, Dr. Wolfe?
Again, there were 3 taped interviews, 2 in March, 1 in May, and then that initial hour and a half. So I have about 9 hours of videotaped interviews and an hour and a half that was not.
So do we have the second date? I see 1, 2, 3. Does that include that one? March 10. What's 3, 3? Okay. Now, on your report, I'm just a little confused, Dr. Wolfe. On your report, it says February 28th, 2017 was the original interview. Is that right?
Right.
And you did not tape that one, is that correct? Or video,
Correct.
I recorded, whatever we,
I mean, just written notes is all I have on that one.
okay. And on 3/3 through 3/10/2017, that was the entire time he was at Central Regional Hospital, is that right?
Right, he was on the inpatient unit of the pretrial evaluation unit from March 3rd to March 10th.
Okay, and so your interview was March 10th, is that right?
On page 4, I have the, right under where I put medications on discharge, that next paragraph, Mr. Campbell had videotaped interviews on 3/3 for 1.5 hours, on 3/10 for about 3.5 hours, and then the next paragraph, he had another videotaped interview on 5/3/2017 that was almost 4 hours.
Do we have the 3/3? Do we have 3/3?
I turned over the SD cards and somebody else made discs. I'm not sure. I never actually viewed the disc to see what was on there.
Okay. We need just a moment to figure this out, Your Honor, because we have, if we can have just a second. That's fine.
Yes.
Defendant's Exhibit 58 and Defendant's Exhibit 59.
for purposes of refreshing recollection for these next questions, if you want to take a look at those.
Sure.
Dr. Wolfe, do those appear to be at least transcripts of 2 of your interviews?
Yes.
Now, Dr. Wolfe, you, during your questioning of Mr. Eric Campbell, you considered a very broad sort of, pretty much considered his whole life. Is that fair to say?
Yes.
I mean, you asked him questions about his childhood, is that right?
Yes.
And you asked him specific questions about his relationships within his family, is that right?
Yes.
You asked him questions about his school history, is that right?
Yes.
You showed him photos of his childhood, is that right?
I did.
And you talked to him about his high school experiences.
Yes.
You talked to him about events leading up to leaving Texas, is that right?
Yes.
And you talked to him about the events surrounding Faulkner's death, correct?
Yes.
And the events that followed, is that right?
Yes.
Now, part of the reason you do that is to try to get sort of a history of, sort of a biographical history of his life, but also to determine how relationships might have affected his life, isn't that right?
Sure.
And you knew in this particular case that his father was also charged with this offense.
Yes, I did.
And his father had committed suicide, isn't that right?
Yes.
And you knew that the common denominator between pretty much the beginning and the very end was Mr. Edward Campbell, isn't that right?
Yes.
I mean, he was always present in these events that occurred, isn't that right?
Except for the 2 that I discussed, the ones prior to leaving Texas and then the ones in West Virginia.
Correct. Now, when you started talking to him about his childhood, and I'm referring to the March 10th interview, when you started that that interview, the first thing you asked him is how he felt, is that right?
Yes.
And he said anxious.
Yes.
And then in the next part, you told him if there's something you don't want to talk about, just tell me. that's fine, isn't that right?
Yes,
And he never said, I don't want to talk about that, did he?
correct.
Never in the interviews did he say, I'm not going to talk to you about a particular subject.
That's correct.
And you ask him specifics about some things that happened in his childhood, is that right? Like you ask him when was Holly pregnant with her first baby, is that right?
Yes,
And he said, I think it was 8th grade. That's on the first page.
yes,
And then he actually disclosed to you that he was being disruptive in class when he was young, and that's why they prescribed him Adderall. Isn't that right?
yes,
You asked him about the decision to homeschool him. Isn't that right?
yes,
And he told you that he and his dad discussed it and thought it was a good idea. Isn't that right? Because he wanted to complete high school early, right?
yes,
And then he said later it sort of turned into babysitting.
yes,
Described it as being very lonely.
yes.
Now, he later talks to you about how sort of these building projects grew from just an idea to doing a lot of work around the house. Isn't that right?
Yes,
And then you ask him some specifics about his relationship with his dad and some of the physical abuse. Isn't that right?
yes,
And he gave you detailed explanations about that, didn't he?
yes, he did.
Then when you said, how much later after that did you go back to high school? He said 11th or 12th, I guess. I don't know. But the school records say it was 11th or 12th, correct?
It was 11.
I'm sorry? It
You
was
said
11th grade
It was
when he
11,
went back.
yes,
And he said, I don't know the time scale. Isn't that correct?
that's what he said.
And you ask him, how'd you all decide to go back?
Yes,
Now, you asked him specifically about his high school transcript, didn't you? Or the types of classes he took.
yes, I asked him about the types of classes he took.
And he described those, didn't he?
Yes,
I mean, he wasn't being vague or evasive about any of that, was he?
no,
Now, you mentioned yesterday, you said something about, I think the prosecutor's question was, when you're talking about bailing his dad out, she said, did he ever own that? Isn't that right? Wasn't that her question?
something like that, yes.
And didn't he say to you when you said, on page 33, she knew that we're trying to bail my dad out, talking about Shane's grandmother?
Yes,
He admitted to you that he was trying to bail his dad out, didn't he?
yes.
So he did own it, didn't he, Dr. Wolfe?
Well, yes and no. Again, it's that tendency he has of giving incomplete answers. So, on one hand, he says that he'll say things like that Shane's grandmother knew that they were trying to bail him out, but then it's my brother and Aunt Sherry, bonded him out, as though he didn't have any responsibility for getting the money for that.
Well, isn't it certainly possible, based on the evidence, that it was Nicholas and Aunt Sherry who actually came up with the money to bail him out? Isn't that true?
Well, overlooking some evidence, yes.
And didn't Eric Campbell testify that he was trying to sell property to help bail his dad out?
Yes,
And didn't Nicholas Campbell wasn't he the one who posted the bond for his dad?
yes,
So through the state's lens, that's inconsistent, is that right?
Are you calling me the state?
Well, I mean, if you're looking at it one way, that's inconsistent, but if you're looking at what he told you, he says, we're trying to bail my dad out.
Again, there's different reports about how he phrases things. But yes, overall, I agree with you.
And on the next page, you mentioned that Shane's grandmother knew y'all were trying to bail him out. How did she find out? And he said, I told her. Isn't that right?
Yes.
I mean, he never denies to you that he was participating in trying to get his dad out of jail. Isn't that right?
I think because you're missing the other interview, this was me reiterating. You're missing the previous interview. That's the problem.
Do we have it? Okay. Now, and you ask him about the time around when his dad didn't go to trial, isn't that right? Didn't go to court in Texas.
Yes.
And he specifically said, the only thing I do know for sure is he skipped trial. He admits to you that he knew his dad didn't go to court, isn't that right?
Yes.
He said, I don't know the dates, but I know he didn't go to court, isn't that right?
Right, but telling me the only thing I know is that he didn't go to trial, again, is one of those evasive comments that I'm referring to.
Well, the question was, did you drive there? How were you going to school? You still had a car. So that's 3 questions. And he says, yeah. I'm
What
sorry,
page are you
page 35.
Okay, I'm sorry, can you repeat your question?
The questions you had for him, did you drive there? How were you going to school? You still had a car? And Eric Campbell, yeah, I had my brother's truck, the Nissan. My brother was using my dad's Tundra for work, and it worked out. Out of all the things my dad didn't lose after he got out, the only thing I do know for sure is he skipped trial. And these are events relayed to you several years later, is that right?
It is.
And he's telling you what he thinks everybody was driving, right?
Absolutely. There's 2 years later, and everybody can have faulty memory, especially after 2 years.
But he was emphasizing the one thing he did know was his dad didn't go to trial, right?
Yes.
And that's the one thing that reflects negatively on him, is that he knew that his dad didn't go to trial. Isn't that right?
Yes.
I mean, whether somebody's driving a Tundra or a Nissan it really is not the most critical matter at that point, is it, Dr. Wolfe?
No.
And then he asked you, I mean, you asked him about how his dad got out to the woods, is that right?
Yes.
And he told you he took him, isn't that right?
On that occasion, yes.
Well, he said that he didn't know exactly the name of the park, but he said he did take him there, isn't that right?
Well, this time he called it Sam Houston.
He said, I thought it was Sam Houston Park, isn't that right?
Yes.
And he said he skipped bail, correct, Dr. Wolfe?
Yes.
I mean, not knowing the name of the park is certainly not as significant as the fact that he knew he skipped bail, is it, Dr. Wolfe?
Absolutely.
And it certainly wouldn't be exaggerating or evasive on the
No.
critical features, would it, Dr. Wolfe?
No.
And the prosecutor asked you about this list. Page 41. And there was some discussion about how he got there and how his dad got there. Is that right?
Yes.
But in the end, he said that they had a meeting. Isn't that right?
Yes.
And he said his dad gave him a list of things to pack.
Yes.
He didn't try to deny that his dad gave him a list of things to pack, did he?
No.
And again, one of the critical elements here is his dad. Isn't that right?
Yes.
The man we heard on the video and the phone yesterday. Isn't that right?
Yes.
And he talked to you about the reasons he wanted to go on this trip, didn't he, Dr. Wolfe?
Yes, he did.
And he told you he was concerned about his father, didn't he?
Yes, he talked about wanting to get him off of drugs and keep him clean.
And he also talked about being mad at him, didn't he? Page 43.
Yes.
He was both mad at him and wanted to help him. Isn't that true?
Yes.
And that's common with people who've been in abusive relationships, isn't it, Dr.
Yes.
Wolfe?
I
It's
would
very
agree with
common
that.
to go back and try to help the person who's abusing you, isn't it?
I would agree, yes.
It's common for people to hang on. Isn't that right?
Yes.
And it's especially the case if it's a child of an abusive parent, isn't that right?
I would agree with that, yes.
And because the child, he's the only person he ever had, isn't that right?
Yes.
In this case, the only consistency was Edward Campbell, isn't that right?
Right.
I mean, there were women in and out of the home, but for short periods of time, isn't that right?
Well, his stepmom was around for 10 years. I wouldn't call that short.
Well, she testified that she didn't have much of a relationship with Eric. Isn't that right?
I didn't hear all of her testimony, but she was in the home for 10 years.
Okay. Now, you mentioned on page 42, you asked him about some of the items that his dad asked him to pack. And he gave you a list of some of those items, isn't that right?
Yes, he did.
Now, he left some of them out. Or did he?
I would have to have the video to remember. It was again 10 hours of interview, and some of these things I went over on more than one occasion, so I cannot recall at this particular moment.
Well, did you say, I'm sorry, what kind of gear on page 42?
Yes.
And camping gear, a sleeping bag, suits, like dress suits. Is that right?
Yes.
And this is stuff that you went out and bought or you got from the house? And then he describes getting it just from the house. Is that correct?
Correct.
Some food stuff, a lot of camping stuff. There was a tarp that we used last time we went camping.
Yes.
A telescope, some warm clothing. And he asked me to bring some weapons that were in the house. A bow, some medieval weaponry, a sword, a dull sword. Play-acting one, saber, and a crossbow. Isn't that right?
Yes.
And he's fairly specific about the things that he told you they were getting. Isn't that right?
Yes.
And there was consistency between those things and what was on the list, isn't that right?
There was definitely some consistency.
Well, the fact, I mean, Dr. Wolfe, you just mentioned that you couldn't remember everything about this interview. It would be reasonable for a person not to remember every single item on a list that he got 2 years before. Wouldn't that be true?
Absolutely.
And you mentioned yesterday that you thought his explanation about the SUV was ridiculous, isn't that right?
Yes, I did.
And on page 44, you ask him about the SUV, isn't that right?
I've never seen these notes typed up before.
No, that's
so-
fine. Take your time. I apologize. But you have seen the videos, isn't that right, Dr. Wolfe?
I haven't seen the video. I took a video of my interview. I haven't seen it since. I have my handwritten notes, and that's all I was relying on. We're on page 43?
The bottom of 43, on 43, about the middle of page, it starts Eric Campbell, isn't that right?
Yeah.
And he gives a long narrative there for the rest of the page.
Yes.
And that's not vague or evasive there, is it, Dr. Wolfe?
No, it was pretty detailed.
And on the next page, he actually talks about his attorneys challenging him about the SUV, doesn't he?
Yes, he does.
But in the context of this conversation, he's already admitted that he knows that his father's leaving Texas to evade the court, isn't that right?
Yes.
And then he talks on the next page about going to Louisiana and his dad stealing the license plate, isn't that right, on page 45?
Yes.
And that's another long narrative, isn't it, Dr. Wolfe?
Yes, it is.
And he talks about his suspicions when he realizes his dad has stolen the license plate, doesn't he?
Yes.
And Louisiana's not that far from Houston, is it, Dr. Wolfe?
No, it's not.
And on page 46, he talks about, on the top paragraph, he's talking about the encounter he had with his father over the license plate, isn't he?
Yes.
And he says, he's just physical, kind of walks up on me a couple inches away, just yelling at me. I just backed down. I believed him. I really, really wanted to believe it. Is that what he says?
Yes.
Now, Dr. Wolfe, is it fair to say that it's not hard to imagine the man we heard on the jail recordings yesterday doing that, is it?
No, not
And
at
based on what we know about Edward Campbell, it's not hard at all imagining him doing that, is it?
all. No.
And based on what we know about people who've been involved in abusive relationships, it's not really hard to imagine a person wanting to believe the abuser, is it?
No.
I mean, it's very common to want to help that person, isn't it?
Yes, it is.
And sometimes believers become enablers, isn't that right?
Yes.
And that's what Mr. Campbell said. He said he really wanted to believe him, didn't he?
Yes.
Dr. Wolfe, that Mr. Campbell had in high school, isn't that right?
Yes.
And one of the issues you brought up was him being caught having sex in a car with a girl, is that right?
Yes.
And both of them were based on what the teacher saw were disciplined by the school, isn't that correct?
Yes.
And they were both disciplined the same, isn't that right?
I don't recall if they're both disciplined the same.
And it was only later that there was some allegation that Mr. Campbell had done something wrong. Isn't that right? Something criminal.
I don't recall the timeline. I just remember the matter was disposed, and that was not, it did not turn into a criminal prosecution.
Right. And in fact, the young woman admitted that it wasn't true, what she had alleged. Isn't that right?
Yes.
Now, you mentioned that there was some inconsistency in what Mr. Campbell told you about substance abuse. Isn't that right?
Yes.
And you started your May 3rd interview talking about his use of substances. Isn't that right?
What I'm noting is I was asking him how he had been doing because I hadn't seen him in over a month.
Right.
And he spoke about stopping the effects or
Right. And on page 3, you asked him about what the first substance he had used,
yes.
and he said it was alcohol.
Yes.
And he told you he was about 15 or 16 years old when he first used alcohol.
Yes.
And then you asked him in general about his use of alcohol.
Yes.
Now, the time between when he was 15 or 16 years old and when he was stopped in this case was 5 years. Isn't that right?
He was almost 22.
Right. So possibly 7 years, 5 to 7 years, depending on which one. And you asked him if he used on weekends or anything like that. Is that right?
Yeah, I was trying to establish a general pattern of use.
And he said, I'm not a fan of beer. Isn't that right?
Yes.
And you said, well, on page 5, you said, what was the next substance you used, correct?
Yes.
Marijuana, right?
Yes.
He said he was 14.
On which page?
It's on page 5.
Yes.
And so that's a year earlier than the first alcohol use, but he's still disclosing using an illegal substance. Isn't that right, Dr. Wolfe?
Yes.
I mean, he's inconsistent about the timing, but there's nothing that benefits him about that, is there, Dr. Wolfe, from a psychiatric standpoint, is there?
No.
It doesn't affect a symptom of the case, does it?
People routinely misrepresent their use of substances, so that's nothing of huge remark.
Well, if anything, he also told you used methamphetamine. Isn't that correct?
Correct.
In fact, didn't he tell the first officer in the first report that he had used that in the past?
Yes.
So he was nothing evasive about that, right?
No.
And it doesn't reflect very well on people in general, does it?
No.
And now, the next page, you actually talk to him about the process of making methamphetamine. Is that right?
Yes.
And did he indicate to you he'd learned that from his father?
Yes, he did.
And you expressed some knowledge of that.
Yes, I have.
Okay. And you said that the ingredients in that they bought at the Home Depot were not consistent with making meth. Isn't that right?
Yes.
Where's that? Do you have that? So, huh? Well, I'm looking for the receipt. Oh. What number is it? 159.
I'm sorry. I apologize, Judge. We're under approach with what's marked as Defendant's Exhibit 159. Now, Dr. Wolfe, how do you have knowledge of making methamphetamines if you
I
don't?
haven't personally made methamphetamine, but I've had
I know that.
evaluations of patients that were incompetent to stand trial, yet they were able to make methamphetamine. So I had to figure out how much cognitive resource it actually took to make methamphetamine. And as it turned out, the person was incompetent to stand trial.
Right.
So,
So, what's our next number? Huh? May I approach you?
Dr. Wolfe, I would approach with what's marked Defendant's Exhibit number 60. Now, I want you to take the Home Depot. This is Attorney General Josh Stein's list of methamphetamine ingredients. Do you see muriatic acid on the Home Depot receipt?
I do.
And do you see it on Attorney General Stein's list of ingredients?
I do. I stand corrected. I did not know that was part of making meth.
And do you see Ember's lighter fluid on there? On the Home Depot receipt? On the Home Depot receipt.
Oh, sorry. Yes.
And do you see starter fluid on Exhibit 60?
Yes.
And do you see drain opener?
Yes.
And do you see drain cleaner?
Yes, I
on the
do.
Home Depot receipt.
Now, Dr. Wolfe, you watched the video of the Home Depot. Who was driving the cart there?
I think I forgot to silence my phone. Sorry. The father and the son were in the cart.
Well, the father was driving the cart, wasn't he?
I'm sorry. Yes.
And the father was the one putting all the ingredients up on the counter, wasn't he?
Yes.
And Dr. Wolfe, you spent some time asking Eric Campbell about his dad's prior charges and things too, didn't you?
Yes,
And those were some of the things he didn't know, right? He said, I don't know what happened to my dad's charges when I was a child, right?
yes,
And assaulting Linda, isn't that right?
yes,
And he said he didn't know what happened with those cases. Isn't that
Yes.
right?
that's
I
correct.
mean, and that would be reasonable, right?
Yes.
And you talked a fair amount about which campground it was and what the name of that campground was, isn't that correct?
Yes,
And he told you he didn't really know the name, isn't that right?
yes,
He wasn't sure of the name.
yes,
But at the same time, he told you that when his dad told him to pack up the gear and put it in the truck, he did it, didn't he?
yes.
And you ask him, about what his dad's plans were, didn't you? On page 36 and 37?
Yes,
And of course, you're asking him what his dad's plans was. And it's fair to say, Dr. Wolfe, that it would be very hard to determine what the man we heard on the recording yesterday's plans were, wouldn't it?
Objection to that.
Yes, no.
I don't know.
Well, he said he was probably going to set up some hovel in the woods. Is that right?
Who do you mean by he?
Eric Campbell was talking to you, and he said that his father was probably going to set up some hovel in the woods, live in the mountains, a simple life or something.
That's what Eric Campbell reported.
And he's also reported that his dad talked all the time, hasn't he? He's testified to that.
Yes,
His dad had lots of different plans all the time, isn't that right?
yes,
And you mentioned the walkie-talkies. Actually, what he told you is one was lost, right?
if that's what is on the recording, I'll go with that, because again, I'm writing down while I'm talking, so I
Right.
would go with the transcript.
He didn't say it was broken. He said it was lost.
If that's what the transcript says, then that's what I'd say. My recall was that one wasn't working, but that's,
But they found one in the car, not two, right? Ultimately.
my recall is only one was found.
And there's some discussion about what he was doing afterwards, isn't there, Dr. Wolfe?
Yes,
And he talks about buying a map and then taking it outside, doesn't he? Page 40.
yes,
And he tells you his dad said that's the wrong one, right?
right,
So he took it back inside, didn't he?
yes,
And he mentioned his dad started pulling fuses out of the truck, page 41.
yes.
And the fuses were pulled out of the truck, weren't they?
I'm sorry, what was your question?
The fuses were pulled out of the truck, weren't they? Isn't that the evidence in this case?
I believe they were, yes.
And on page 43 at the bottom, you say, so your father decided who was going to drive which car?
Yes,
And he said, my father decided everything.
yes.
Now, you've talked about this rock that he said he smashed. And I think your testimony was he was inconsistent because he said he smashed the rock. Is that right?
He smashed the gun with a rock, yes.
And then, but on page 49 at the bottom, he said he picked up a rock and put it down, and then I hid the rock.
Except that right before that it says bashed it with.
Bashed it with. And didn't the crime scene investigator say he found the gun under a rock?
Yes,
And Mr. Campbell never said I broke the gun or I splintered it or anything like that. He said I bashed it with it. Is that right?
yes.
And now, the prosecutor asked you if he ever mentioned a purse, and I believe your answer was no. Is that right?
No, we talked about the purse.
Well, she talked about hiding the purse, but do you remember him talking about it?
I see my notes here that we talked about the purse.
And he said there was a purse on the passenger seat. I picked it up and I walked away. Isn't that right?
Yes,
He told you that.
yes.
How many total hours did you interview Mr. Campbell?
Around 10.
And how many hours had he been interviewed before you interviewed? Do you know?
No, I do not.
Well, do you know that he met with Detective Baker on the 1st of January?
Yes.
And have you seen the video of that?
Yes,
And did you see his face swelling up?
I did.
And did you see the video of his interview with Detective McPhee the next day?
I don't remember which videos I watched versus which
Right.
which transcripts I've read.
But you reviewed those, is that correct?
I reviewed them.
And did you review the interview with the two state police officers a few days later
Yes, I believe I did.
and the FBI later?
Yes.
Now, when you were talking about post-traumatic stress disorder, Dr. Wolfe, you talked about the types of trauma that could occur to a person, isn't that right?
Yes,
And you emphasized the fact that it's post-trauma, after the trauma, isn't that right?
correct.
So, but the reality is if the trauma occurs early in life and the person stays in the same environment, the trauma continues, isn't that right?
Well, that would constitute the chronic post-traumatic stress disorder, yes.
And that's what all of the psychiatrists at Central Prison have diagnosed Mr. Eric Campbell with, isn't that right?
I don't believe that's accurate.
Well, Dr. Newman diagnosed him with that, isn't that right?
There have been a few psychiatrists who've diagnosed him with post-traumatic stress disorder, but I saw other diagnoses in there as well.
He's been treated for post-traumatic stress disorder for the last 2 years at Central Prison, isn't that right?
That's what his treatment team is saying, yes.
The chronic form, isn't that right?
Yes,
And that's based on severe childhood abuse, isn't that right?
yes, by his report, yes.
And, well, but by more than just his report, isn't that right?
Well, no, actually, that's the part that I'm trying to say, that the reports vary significantly.
Well, there's certainly indications that to support or corroborate the self-report. Isn't that true, Dr. Wolfe?
There are some elements that can be corroborated, but I don't know that, that there are some distinct differences.
Well, Dr. Wolfe, have you examined, you've said you've examined about 2,000 people, is that right?
I have.
Have you examined people who've harmed children?
Yes, I have.
And you've examined people who've harmed children who've never been caught for harming children, haven't you? Before they were talking to you. Isn't that true?
I'll let you restate your question.
Well, isn't it true that some people harm children without getting caught?
Yes,
And isn't it true that in this case, there was certainly indication that there was strong suspicion that Mr. Campbell was physically abusing his children?
what I reviewed on his history were reports that there were neglect situations that were investigated, and when psychologists who do this type of work with child protective custody assessed him, they did not see it.
Well, didn't they say they were concerned about physical abuse in the home?
Yes, they expressed concern, but no one said he's been physically abused.
Well, didn't they say that they were concerned about future abuse in the home and danger to the children?
Yes, they did.
Now, and Dr. Wolfe, you saw the bullet holes in the wall, didn't you?
I did.
And that in and of itself is dangerous to a child, isn't it?
Yes.
And a person who will do that doesn't need to be raising a child, does it?
Objection.
I think I'm an expert on who should be raising a child, so I'll defer on that one.
Well, have you had cases where one of the allegations was a guy just shut off rounds in the house while his baby was asleep before?
I'm not sure I'm following your question.
It's an unusual thing to do, isn't it, Dr. Wolfe, to shoot a gun inside a house with a baby sleeping?
Yes.
And it's very dangerous for the children, isn't it?
Yes.
And that's certainly consistent with childhood abuse, isn't it?
Yeah, I would say yes. Now, and Dr. Wolfe, you're aware of the assault of
Holly Campbell, is that right?
Yes, I am.
And you're aware that that assault lasted for nearly the whole night, didn't it?
Yes.
And that Edward Campbell used multiple weapons on Holly Campbell, isn't that right?
I don't recall yes, there was an attempt at hanging and a pipe, as I recall. Yes.
And a handgun, isn't that right?
Yes.
And there were other children in the home at that time, isn't that right, Dr. Wolfe?
Yes.
And Dr. Wolfe, you talked a lot about the functioning of someone with post-traumatic stress disorder in your testimony, is that right?
Yes.
And there are people with post-traumatic stress disorder who at least appear like they're functioning okay at times, isn't that right?
Definitely.
And the truth is that sometimes without stressors, those people function very well.
Yes.
And the stressors are what bring on the dissociative or the other states, isn't that correct?
Yes. There's usually a stressor associated with it. But
And the
again,
stressor can be someone who's,
That insurance.
I'm sorry, I thought
But the
you were-
main reason that not everyone who's experienced trauma, the reason that not everyone who has experienced trauma has PTSD is that you have to have functional impairment
Right.
from your trauma.
And the people who might experience these types of episodes are certainly one of the stressors could be interacting with the person who committed the trauma to begin with, isn't that right? In the first place, I should say.
Well, the dissociative episode should have something to do with the trauma, yes.
And traumatic events are what cause the dissociative episode, isn't that right? Or
Not
can
necessarily.
cause. But they can cause the dissociative episode, isn't that right?
They can.
And certainly see the person who's abused you all your life commit these types of acts would be traumatic, wouldn't it, Dr. Wolfe?
I think so, yes.
Nothing further.
Yes, sir. Dr. Wolfe, in your opinion, did the defendant have functional impairment, or do these records reflect that the defendant had functional impairment?
No, and what I mean by functional impairment is somebody who's able to interact appropriately in social settings and work settings. That's by my review of the records and looking through all the people who knew him, his functioning was good.
Have you ever evaluated someone who was having a dissociative episode during a criminal act?
I have.
And what, if you can describe that?
Well, there have been more than one persons that I viewed as having a dissociative episode even during a murder. And one of them was a young man who'd had terrible childhood abuse with sexual trauma committed by numerous men. And there was an episode that he did not recall, but that somehow he was linked to the murder of the old man. And it was related to his re-experiencing the sexual trauma somehow, but he didn't have a recall of this murder.
So he had no recall of the event?
No. He thought that he might have done it because he saw blood on his robe.
Defense counsel asked you and said several times that Ed Campbell was the common denominator when the defendant was engaged in, or at least knew that there was criminal activity or anything bad that went on in the household. Is that a fair assessment?
Yes.
In reviewing the juvenile records, was Ed Campbell present when the defendant broke into and vandalized a church when he was a teenager?
No,
Is the defendant charged with making methamphetamines or marijuana in this case?
no.
Did you see anywhere in the evidence that you reviewed that there, and I understand that you are not a drug expert, but did you read anything or see anywhere in the evidence collection that there were in fact methamphetamines that were collected out of the truck or the SUV?
No.
And Central Prison, the treatment team at Central Prison has made a diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder. What is different in what they do versus what you have done here?
Well, again, the difference with Eric Campbell at Central Prison is that he's been arrested. So there's a huge stressor that wasn't present before. So having pending murder charges is enough to give anyone anxiety. So he was treated with an antidepressant. He also since stopped that antidepressant, telling me that the antidepressant wasn't going to change the source of his depression. And he said he was fine without it. So it was, again, there's a huge intervening difference with what they're seeing. And he may well have had trauma from New Year's Eve, New Year's Day.
And I don't have anything further.
Thank you, Carl.
Well, I think I need to give me just a second.
Actually, what he told you about and effects are used to treat post-traumatic stress disorder too, isn't it, Dr. Wolfe?
Yes, it is.
It's not just an antidepressant, is that correct?
Well, it's categorized as an antidepressant.
But it's used to treat post-traumatic stress disorder, correct?
Almost all the antidepressants are also used for post-traumatic stress disorder treatment, yes.
And what he actually told you about discontinuing use was that he had some trouble in moving around from different places, that he didn't get it some days, isn't that right?
Yes, he told me that as a result of having to go between facilities, some days he wasn't receiving it.
And the withdrawals were uncomfortable.
That's what he reported.
So he quit taking it at that time.
Yes.
So it's really not, it's not that it didn't, he didn't say that it didn't help, is that right? He said that he didn't like the withdrawals. Isn't that fair?
Yes, that's fair.
Now, you mentioned functioning appropriately. One of the things you look to is the circumstances of a person's functioning, isn't that right?
Yes.
And the things you named, his relationship with Chloe and some of his work life, happened after he left the home, isn't that right? After he moved out.
Yes.
And Ed Campbell wasn't with him when he moved out, isn't that right?
Correct.
Now, but despite that, he went to 2 different community colleges over 2 years, isn't that right?
Yes.
And you said he was above average intelligence.
Yes.
And he didn't do well in the first community college, did he?
No.
And he had 3 or 4 jobs over a 2-year period, isn't that right?
Yes.
And they were different types of jobs,
Yes.
and they were all pretty, not high-paying jobs, is that right?
No.
Nothing further.
Nothing further.
Okay, anybody, anything? Yes, what you did release on her screen.
Yeah, Judge, I am asking that, but I would ask if she just wait just a minute after the jury's released. I think we just need to talk about something.
You object to remember?
I don't think so, Your Honor, but let's just wait a minute so we can talk, and then we'll figure that out.
Okay. Any further action we have to
No, sir.
take? I need to bring them back, find out who you are.
Yeah.
Ladies and gentlemen, we'll take our lunch and recess at this point. About this case. Did not talk to the parties, the witnesses, or the lawyers about anything at all. Further, did not talk to anyone else, allow anyone say anything in your presence about this case. If you want to communicate with you in any way, any fashion, please let the sheriff know back when you come in. They'll do individual research, investigation on your own about any issue touching on this file. Stay away from the smartphone, and do not form or express an opinion about this case during this time. With that, while everybody else will remain seated, I will excuse the seventh interview and ask that you return and assemble in the room at 2 o'clock this afternoon. The record should reflect who's asked for anything reference that.
Your Honor, I would just say, it does appear that there is a third video, a 1.5 hour video on March the 3rd, that we do not have. We will certainly look about getting that, and I didn't know if that would change. I just didn't want to let her go if the defense had any extra questions about those particular things. We will get them to them as soon as we can and turn them over. It's an 1.5 hour video. I don't know why it's not on the card. I know Dr. Wolfe said she didn't review them. There was a very complicated get it converted and had to put it on a disc, and anyway, that's where we are with that. I mean, it's noted that there were 3 interviews, and okay.
Anything rest of the
Nothing other than that, Your Honor.
The sheriff will recess at 2 o'clock.
Everyone stand.
Thank you, Secretary. God save the state on board. Good to see you.
The record should reflect the years after the courtroom. Yes, sir.
Your Honor, we actually probably about 5 minutes ago, a lieutenant from Butler Public Safety delivered an SD card and a camcorder that does have a recording from March the 3rd. We've told that to the defense. Of course, they haven't seen it. It is an 1.5 hour long, and we can certainly let them view that if that's what they'd like to. I think Dr. Wolfe has told us, obviously not on the record, what's on what she believes is on the video. It's the admission things that she asked him, and I guess there was an exam or a questionnaire that she did with him that's on there. But we do have it. We did not have it before now. I'm not sure why, or if we just didn't get it on a disc, but.
For sure, give you an opportunity to do it and see whatever it is you need to do. Because of that, it includes bringing Dr. Wolfe back on the stand. What I think I'll do is bring the jury in and excuse them for an hour. It may be that you get the parts you can skip over, but don't take as much time as you need.
Okay.
Just happens. Is that acceptable to the state?
It is to us, Judge.
Is that acceptable to the
Yes,
state?
sir. That's fine.
You can bring the jury in. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Technology is a great thing when it works. And when it doesn't, there are problems. And we've had a problem, which I'll be glad to tell you about after this trial is over. But we think we found a way to get around our problem, but it's going to take a little time. Hopefully that can be done in an hour. I don't want to keep you back there unless you want to be back there for an hour. If you want to be anywhere else, I'm going to let you go. But I'm going to ask that you come back and assemble in the jury room
at 3 o'clock. Hopefully we'll have everything done then. If we find out we've got more problems, then we'll give you another break. Be mindful of the instructions I've given you earlier. You're still bound by those. We thank you for your services, and I'll excuse all of you until 3 o'clock when I ask that you return back there. Thank you. Records should reflect all jurors have to courtroom. Anything the record of the state?
No, sir.
Anything the record of the defendant?
No, sir.
Okay, we'll be in recess for till 3 o'clock. And again, if you need more time from that, take, that's just a time.
We'll be in recess until 3 o'clock.
I don't. I think it's a report.
Hey, Susan, how you doing?
No, it's on.
Good to see you. Well, thank you.
Oh, yeah. One day of it.
Well, that's great. You got to come back and stay more.
I wish I could.
You'd have enjoyed this one.
Oh, there's no question about it. No question about it.
This is different. Record for the state.
Nothing for the record for the state judge.
Hey, the record for the defendant.
Yeah, we're satisfied that what the video shows is Dr. Wolfe's intake interview. We didn't watch the whole thing, but it looks like it was going right along with her notes. All I'd ask is to get a copy of that at some point, and then I think we're satisfied that she can be released.
That's fine, but she's getting a copy right. I mean, we're getting a copy made as we speak.
Okay, so all of the evidence in the case has now been presented?
Yes, sir.
Yes.
Okay, what I'll do is I'll bring the jury in, excuse them until tomorrow morning.
And Your Honor, let me just state for the record, Dr. Wolfe was down there with us, and she assured us that that's all that's on the tape. So I'm counting on that, and we'll get a copy of that. I'm satisfied that's what it would be.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Sheriff, you may invite the jury in. Ladies and gentlemen, all of the evidence in this case has now been presented. It's now my task to conduct a charge conference with the lawyers. That's where I tell them what I'm going to tell you so that when they make their closing statements to you, they will know what I'm going to say. Although we have enough time to conduct a charge conference, we don't have enough time for them to make arguments to you this afternoon. Yourselves about this case. But you do not talk to the parties, the witnesses, or the lawyers about anything at all. It's your further duty not to talk to anyone else, to allow anyone else to talk with you, or to say anything in your presence about this case. If anyone communicates with you in any way about this case, in any form, you need to let the sheriff know about it when you come in the morning. Do not do any individual research or investigation on your own about any issue touching on this trial. Stay away from computers in any form. Avoid reading, watching, listening to any accounts of this trial. And ladies and gentlemen, do not form or express any opinion about this case during this time. With that, while everyone else in the court remains seated, I'm going to excuse the 17 of you and ask that you return and assemble in the jury room tomorrow morning at 9:30. That you are excused. The record should reflect that all the jurors are absent from the courtroom. Any motions on behalf of the defendant?
Yes, sir, Your Honor. We would move to dismiss each charge on the ground that the evidence is insufficient as a matter of law on every element of each charge to support submission of the charge to the jury, and that submission to the jury would therefore violate the 14th Amendment. Further, we move to dismiss each charge on the ground that, as to each charge, there is a variance between the crime alleged in the indictment and any crime for which the state's evidence may have been sufficient to warrant submission to the jury, and that submission to the jury would therefore violate the 5th, 6th, and 14th Amendment.
Thanks, sir. Motion denied. Council, we now convene for the purpose of a charge conference pursuant to Rule 21 of the General Rules of Practice and General Statute 15A.12.31. Let me say at the outset that at the conclusion of my instructions to the jury, I'll ask each of you if you desire to be heard pursuant to the provisions of Rule 21 of General Statute 15A.12.31. If you do desire to be heard, you should approach the bench, and I will hear you at the bench out of the hearing of the jury. If when you're at the bench you advise me that you want to be heard on the record and out of the presence of the jury, I'll excuse the jury and hear you on the record as you have requested. I prepared a proposed verdict sheet and some instructions as to the counts in this particular case. These are proposed instructions. I made copies for each of you and I will give you now an opportunity to review them to see if you've got any additions, corrections, or objections to these instructions. Actually, I've made one for the defendant also, and these are for y'all. State ready? Defendant ready?
I think so.
Yes.
Okay, so you'll know, in addition to instructions on the counts, I would intend to instruct on burden of proof, reasonable doubt, credibility of witnesses, weight of the evidence, circumstantial evidence, duty to consider all the evidence, judge impartial, unanimous verdict. You know, the other things. With those instructions that I've given to the state, are there any additions, corrections, or objections to any of these instructions?
Your Honor, with respect to some correction on page 3, guilty of cruelty to animals, the dog's name was Toby. The dog was named Toby, not Tolly.
Okay, T-O-B-B-A,
I don't,
sir?
T-O-B-Y.
T-O-B-Y, wait, okay, wait a minute. Okay, that's under number 7, yes, sir.
Yes, Your Honor, and that would also be in count 7, intentionally killed a dog named Toby.
Okay, I only have it one time in here, is that correct?
You'll have it twice. It'll be on the page 3, and then it'll be on the last page.
Page 3?
On the verdict sheet, excuse me, I'm sorry.
Oh, on the verdict sheet.
Verdict sheet, I'm looking at it.
Okay,
On the verdict sheet, it should be there one time, and then on the instructions, it'll be on the last page under count number 7.
okay.
Otherwise, Your Honor, we don't have any other changes with proposed at this time.
Any additions, corrections, or objections have it? And
Yes, sir, we filed, and I'm providing copies to the state, we filed just before the break some written requests, and I have one more additional written request. If I can approach the clerk, I'll provide it, or I'll provide Your Honor and file it afterward. The written request that we have made, first, Your Honor, under lesser included offenses, we request second-degree murder, which Your Honor is given. We request involuntary manslaughter, that there, under the case of State v. Phillips, a defendant can be guilty of involuntary manslaughter due to the unintentional killing of a human being without malice caused by culpable negligence, or a culpably negligent act, or a culpably negligent omission. I think there's been evidence in this case in which a jury could find that Mr. Campbell's failure to act on the date in question, failure to take steps to stop his father, failure to seek police assistance, could qualify for that, and there's been evidence to support that. And I would request that the court give involuntary manslaughter. I would also request lesser included count of burglary for misdemeanor breaking and entering due to evidence of lack of intent to commit a felony inside. And also for robbery with a dangerous weapon, we would ask for the lesser included felonies of common law robbery, felony larceny, and misdemeanor larceny. And I'm happy to continue and go through all my requests. So
yes, sir.
Yes. The second request we have it's in fairness a preservation issue, Your Honor. We're asking the court to instruct under the old rule of State v. Blankenship rather than State v. Barnes for acting in concert. It's our position that State v. Barnes is wrongly decided, and that it allows a defendant to be convicted of first-degree murder absent a showing of premeditation and intent. And I don't need to be heard on that any further. They have a full written argument on that I filed. We are also asking for additional instructions in the section relating to premeditation and deliberation. Specifically, after the section that talks about premeditation and deliberation being susceptible to direct proof, we'd ask for the language, on the other hand, you may infer from the circumstances that the defendant did not premeditate or deliberate the killing. For example, you may find that the defendant was frightened, disoriented, emotionally upset, panic-stricken, or agitated. If so, you may consider this finding in deciding whether the defendant formed the intent to kill.
Where's the evidence of that? I understood he said not guilty and said he did not participate in the murders at all.
Well, I understand that, Your Honor, but the jury could reject our contention and agree with the state's contention that he did commit one of those acts, and there has been evidence that he did not have a cool state of mind at that time and that he was agitated.
Okay.
We would also ask for, under acting in concert for the full pattern 202.10 instruction, the part after the parentheses in the pattern, it says a defendant is not guilty of a crime merely because the defendant is present at the scene, even though the defendant may silently approve of the crime or secretly intend to assist in its commission. To be guilty, the defendant must aid or actively encourage the person committing the crime, or in some way communicate to another person the defendant's intention to assist in its commission. Third, as to the first count and the second count, as far as the basis of felony murder, during that instruction, Your Honor, we would ask that the jury be instructed regarding what I've titled there a separate transaction defense. In other words, that the state has the burden to show that the burglary and the deaths resulted from an unbroken chain of events, and that's an issue for the jury to decide. And I have a full instruction you can see there about that the jury must decide whether it was one continuous transaction or if they were not committed in one continuous offense. You must find the defendant not guilty of first-degree murder under the felony murder doctrine. And then it lists things the jury can consider in making that determination, and cites the cases that are the basis for that. And I would just say that the evidence of that, Your Honor, it is possible that the jury could find that after Mr. Campbell and his father went to Walmart, that he had a different state of mind than at the first instance. So they could find that he actually didn't commit any crimes at the first time, but then when they returned to the house, that he had a different state of mind. And we think that the jury should be instructed on that because they have to determine whether or not that second time he went into the home is a separate transaction from the killing. And we've also requested instructions on the defense of duress. I noted that Your Honor included it as to robbery. We would request duress as to the charge of burglary, cruelty to animals, and arson. We would also request the defense of automatism or unconsciousness based on dissociation to all the charges, which is pattern jury instruction 302.10, as well as the defense of diminished capacity, pattern jury instruction 305.11 on both the 2 counts of first-degree murder as well as the robbery and the burglary. I believe there was testimony from Dr. Chaudhry that Mr. Campbell's ability to form intent was diminished as to all of those counts. I'm happy to answer specific questions or go back through those, but those would be all of our requests.
That's his thing.
Your Honor, we're opposed to each and every one of them. Which one do you want to talk about first?
I'm glad to hear anything you want to say.
Well, with respect to the issue of, the involuntary manslaughter, Your Honor, the use of poison implies malice. Lying in wait implies malice. We simply not entitled to an instruction on involuntary manslaughter. And I just got these, so I'm sorry I didn't have time to review that. But just in preparing, in the State v. Smith, involuntary manslaughter defined as the unlawful intentional killing of another without malice. In this instance case, they were not entitled to an instruction on voluntary manslaughter because in this case they used poison, and that's exactly what Eric Campbell and his father are accused of doing: lies and poison. And Your Honor, under those circumstances, sending involuntary manslaughter back is they're not entitled to that instruction. Your Honor, we're opposed to the request for the additional instruction on premeditation and deliberation. I think what is there is satisfactory. I think that I don't think that this is necessary, and I think it's going to unduly confuse the jury, and I don't think it's supported by the evidence in this case. Your Honor, with respect to the separate transaction defense, I think there's ample evidence and nothing to contradict that this was all part of one transaction occurrence. And, Your Honor, with respect to the diminished capacity, Your Honor, I don't believe that there is sufficient evidence for the jury to find, by preponderance of evidence, that there was diminished capacity in this case. Dr. Chaudhry's testimony was that she did not review the evidence completely, and she ignored some of the collateral evidence, and therefore I don't believe there's sufficient evidence for the jury to be able to find by preponderance of evidence that the defendant did not have the requisite capacity at the time these offenses were committed.
Any further?
Well, Your Honor, whether or not the state thinks that they have met their burden is really not the issue here. The issue is, was there credible testimony that the jury could rely upon that, and Dr. Chaudhry did testify that his capacity was diminished. So it's possible the jury could believe the state's version of events, that Mr. Campbell did some of those things, and also believe Dr. Chaudhry's testimony that his ability to form the specific intent for murder in both counts, as well as robbery and burglary, was diminished.
Your Honor, diminished capacity is just not available to lying in wait. It's not available to torture. And I believe that there is a case law that would support, under these circumstances, they're going to give great deference to the trial court as far as looking at evidence and making a decision about what to send back to the jury. And sending diminished capacity back when it's not applicable to these other two theories of murder is, I think it's going to unduly confuse the jury, and I don't believe that, I'll just say that.
If I just may add, Your Honor, it's certainly relevant to premeditation and deliberation, which is a theory that the state is, this theory that's being presented to the jury. And I would also, and in both torture and lying in wait do have components of specific intent that the state has a burden to prove in this case.
I will add the second paragraph from pattern jury instruction 20210 on the acting in concert. Remaining instructions, request instructions on defendant denied.
I'm sorry, all the
denied. Anything further for the state is to instructions. Anything further for the defendant is to instructions.
No, Your Honor, we just note our exception under the 6th, 8th, and 14th Amendment, as well as, under the 6th, 8th, and 14th Amendment, as well as if they are supported by evidence and accurate statements of law.
Thanks, sir. Are y'all going to open and close?
Your Honor, I believe our intention would be just to close. We would divide our time up between the cats.
Y'all can do any order you want to. Y'all can juggle it around. I think that's the way it is in this. I can't limit you.
I understand.
So y'all understand you go first, or both of you going to argue?
You're probably.
You're not bound by what you tell me now.
Probably.
I'm just trying to get an idea.
Probably. That's my guess.
And again, I cannot limit how long you talk. Do you have any idea?
I don't think it'll be extremely long. I don't think it'll be hours, in other words. I wouldn't want to say it's just going to be an hour, but I wouldn't think it would be hours.
I hope we could go in under an hour, Judge, but And then once we start talking, sometimes that doesn't
I'm not
happen.
limiting you if y'all want to go all day, that's the right. Well, it would be my intention if you argue and would have a recess, then you can argue, and then we'll see where we are as far as lunch goes. I hate to lose my alternate jurors, so I like to hold on to them as long as I can, but we'll see. Maybe I'll charge in the morning, maybe I won't. But again, you can argue any way you want to. Anything further for the record of the state?
Not for the statement.
Anything further record of the state?
Not right now, Your Honor.
Y'all are satisfied with the verdict sheet?
Yes, Your Honor.
I think so, Your
If
Honor.
you find something over the
Yeah,
night,
we'll find something.
that's easy to remedy. And I will add this second part to acting. There were some other things. I didn't have a period after a sentence, and I had 2 periods after another one, but I saw those when I went over.